Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this session of Spokane Public Schools Keep Learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all of our fourth graders out there, and any child who is interested can join us. My name is Sarah, and I'm an instructional coach at Cooper Elementary in Spokane Schools, and I will be your teacher for this lesson today. I'm so glad you are participating with me today. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it on the KSPS website. You can still tune into today's lesson even if you haven't seen any of our others. Today we will be learning how to integrate information from two texts on the same topic. The topic is civil rights and includes two texts, one a biography and one an informational text. The biography is about a woman determined to gain voting rights for women, and the other, the informational text, is about the U.S. Constitution. For today's lesson, you will need a piece of paper and something to write with. I'll give you a moment to gather your materials. Let's read our learning target together. I can integrate information from two texts on the same topic. Today we'll be using this graphic organizer to organize our work and compare the information from the two texts. In order to compare the text, we will need to look for details in each text that tells us what the main idea is. Remember, we'll be thinking about the main idea of the text and figure out what it is by the end using text details. This will make it so we can compare both of the texts in order to integrate information in our written response in tomorrow's lesson. Let's begin reading I Could Do That by Linda Arms White, pictures by Nancy Carpenter. In 1820, 6-year-old Esther McQuigg studied her mother making tea. I could do that, she said. Make tea? Asked Mama. The older girls do that. But I want to learn, said Esther, and she did. She pumped water into the kettle and set it on the wood stove to boil. She scooped tea leaves into the teapot, then poured steaming water over them. Esther strained the tea into cups, one for her mother, one for herself. As they sat near the window of their New York house, Esther saw men riding by in their best suits, some carrying flags. Where are those men going, Mama? Asked Esther. They are going to vote for the next president of the United States, Mama said. Will Papa vote? Yes, Papa always votes. Will you vote, Mama? No, dear, only men can vote. When Esther was 8, she watched her mother sew a fine seam. The needle pulled thread in and out, tracking tiny, even stitches across the fabric. Esther felt her hands mimicking her mother's. I could do that, she said, and she did. She made clothes for her doll from scraps, and when her stitches became neat and straight, she sewed a shirt for Papa. When Esther was 11, her mother died, and for the first time she saw her father cry. He gathered his 11 children together. I don't know what we'll do without your mama, he said. I'm depending on each of you to be brave and to take care of one another. Esther, 8th of the 11, cried too. But then she said, I can do that, Papa, and she did. When Esther was 19, 6 feet tall and on her own, she earned a living making dresses with leg of mutton sleeves for society ladies. When the ladies wanted hats to match the dresses, Esther designed and made those too. Soon she thought of opening a millinery shop. You are much too young to run a business, she was told. I don't see why, was Esther's reply, and with that she opened a hat shop in Owego, New York. Esther started attending abolitionist meetings at her church, but a throng of people who believed in the right to own slaves threatened to stop the meetings even if they had to tear down the Baptist church where they were held. You can't do that, Esther said. I'll stop anyone who tries. When Esther was 28, she married Artemus Slack, and a few years later had a son they called Archie. But when Artemus died in an accident, Esther made a big decision. I'm moving to Illinois, she told her friends. I'll claim the land Artemus owned there and raise our son. You can't do that, her friends cried. Illinois is the very edge of civilization. It's full of dangerous people and wild animals. Yes, she said, I can. And that was that. In Illinois, she fought long and hard to claim Artemis's land, but was denied her inheritance because she was female. So Esther opened another hat shop. Esther met and married John Morris, a merchant and immigrant from Poland, and in 1851 she gave birth to twin boys, Edward and Robert. But John had a hard time making a living, so while Esther raised the children, cooked the meals, and washed the clothes, she helped earn the money too. When Esther was 46, she went with John to the presidential election polls and watched through the window while he voted. You know, she told him when he came out, I could do that. Politics is the business of men, my dear, he said. Said Esther, it's our country too. When war broke out between the northern and southern states, Esther was proud that Archie joined the victorious fight of the North to end slavery. Soon after, an amendment to the Constitution granted African American men all rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. When Esther heard Susan B. Anthony speaking about women's rights, Esther began to hope that someday women might vote too. In 1869, when Esther was 55, she and her 18-year-old sons moved to the newly formed Wyoming Territory, where John and Archie, who'd gone there the year before, waited. Esther and the boys traveled by train across miles of prairie, then by stage over rocky hills to South Pass City, a dusty, hurriedly built town where gold had been found. Most of the 2,000 people who lived there were rowdy young men. The Morrises moved their belongings into a small log cabin, and South Pass City became home. John tried his hand at another business. Archie brought a printing press and started a newspaper. Esther opened another hat shop. But with 6 men to every woman, there was always a need for someone to nurse the sick and wounded, sew clothes, help deliver babies, and give motherly advice to the few young women in town. I could do that, Esther said, and she did. One day, Esther read a proclamation tacked to a wall. All male citizens, 21 and older, are called to vote in the first territorial election. Esther looked around at the disorderly young men. It's time I did that, she said. When Esther's sons watched her march toward home, they knew it was more likely that things were about to change than that things would stay the same. Esther invited the 2 men running for the territorial legislature to her house to speak to the citizens. Then she sent out invitations to the most influential people in the territory. Come for tea and talk to the candidates. She scrubbed her tiny home from top to bottom, washed the curtains, and ironed her best dress. When the candidates and guests arrived, Esther served them tea. One thing I like about Wyoming, she said, is how everyone is important. It takes all of us to run the town, women as well as men. Yes, her guests agreed, and it's a place where people aren't afraid to try new things. Her guests agreed again. Esther smiled. She turned to the candidates. Then would you, if elected, introduce a bill in the legislature that would allow women to vote? Suddenly, in that tiny room full of people, not a sound was heard. Finally, Colonel William Bright spoke. Mrs. Morris, my wife would like to vote too. She is intelligent and well educated. Truth be told, she would be a more informed voter than I. If I'm elected, I will introduce that bill. Not wanting to be outdone, the other candidate, Herman Nickerson, also agreed. Applause broke out in that tiny cabin, and Esther dropped to her chair. Thank you, she said. People warned her that once the bill was introduced, the men of the legislature would have to approve it, and the governor would have to sign it. This had never happened anyway. Why did she think that it could happen here? But Esther had seen things that were not likely to happen every day. She wrote letters and visited legislators to make sure this bill would happen too. And it did. On December 10th, 1869, Governor John Campbell signed this bill into law. Wyoming women got the right to vote. Woo! Women across the country rejoiced for the women of Wyoming, but some people didn't like it. Only 8 days later, Judge James Stillman, the county's justice of the peace, turned in his resignation. He refused to administer justice in a place where women helped make the laws. Word went out that a new justice of the peace was needed. Esther's boys turned to her. "Mama, you could do that," they said, and so she applied. Archie, then clerk of the court, proudly swore his mother in, making Judge Esther Morse the first woman in the country to hold public office. But Judge Stillman refused to turn over the official court docket to Esther. "Never mind," she said. "Archie, will you please go to the mercantile and buy me a ledger? I'll start my own docket." And of course she did. On September 6, 1870, 1 year after her tea party, Judge Esther Morse put on her best dress and walked with her husband John and her sons down the dusty street to the polling place. She would be one of 1,000 Wyoming women voting that day, the first ever given that right permanently by any governing body in the United States. As they walked, John, who still didn't think women should vote, tried to coach her on which candidates and issues to vote for. Esther held up her hand. "I can do this," she said, and she did. So what do you think the main idea of this text, "I can do that," is? I think the main idea of "I could do that" is that Esther Morse won women the right to vote in Wyoming. That's a big event that occurred in history. Let's read our next story. Remember to think about the main idea of this text as we read. The Role of the Constitution by Carl Desoto. The Constitution. A constitution is a plan of government. A government is a system of leaders and laws by which a community, state, or nation is governed. The United States Constitution sets up the national government. It says that all citizens should be treated fairly by government. It says that their freedom should be protected. Each state has a state constitution that sets up the government for that state. A state constitution must obey the United States Constitution. It cannot take away rights granted by the United States Constitution. The Constitution sets up the United States government as a democracy, which means that the people elect leaders to govern them. The government gets its power from the people, so it is a republic. Citizens elect leaders to represent them in government. The three branches. The United States Constitution organizes the national government into three branches or parts. These three branches are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Likewise, each state has a government divided into these three branches. The Constitution tells what each branch of the government can and cannot do. Rights and freedoms. The United States Constitution provides rights and freedoms for American citizens. The Bill of Rights is a part of the Constitution. It lists the many rights and freedoms of American citizens. These freedoms include freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. It also protects Americans accused of crimes by giving them the right to a trial by jury. One important right is the right to choose leaders and make decisions by majority rule. Under the Constitution, each citizen who is at least 18 years old gets one vote in an election. The winner is the person or idea that gets the most votes. Duties of citizens. Americans' rights are balanced by duties. For example, the right to choose leaders is balanced by the duty to vote. The right to a jury trial is balanced by the duty to serve on a jury. The government provides services for American citizens. It maintains the military to protect the country in times of war. It helps people rebuild their communities after natural disasters. In return, citizens have the duty to pay taxes. The money from taxes pays for the costs of running the government. The Constitution gives the government the right to collect taxes. So this graph right here shows the presidential election voter turnout rates between 1960 and 2008. It's the percentage of people eligible to vote who actually voted in the elections during those years. In most years, more than half of eligible voters did their duty by voting to elect the president. In recent years, more than 60%. So let's review our learning target. I can integrate information from two texts on the same topic. Now let's think about what the main idea of the role of the Constitution is. The main idea of the role of the Constitution is that the U.S. Constitution provides and protects rights and freedoms of citizens. Here's our graphic organizer that will help us compare the two texts. Let's go ahead and enter the main idea of each text that we discussed. So the main idea of I could do that is that Esther Morris won women the right to vote in Wyoming. The main idea of the role of the Constitution is that the U.S. Constitution provides and protects the rights and freedoms of citizens. So our question is, what details or information can you find in both texts? And when we do this, we're not necessarily looking for the exact same sentences or words, but rather what is similar in both texts? What could we find in the role of the Constitution that might have had something to do with information from I could do that? Let's think back. So in the role of the Constitution, on our first page in the first paragraph, it says that the Constitution says that all citizens should be treated fairly by government and that their freedom should be protected. This reminds me of in I Could Do That, it said, in Illinois, Esther fought long and hard to claim Artemis's land, but was denied her inheritance because she was female. So this makes me think that during I Could Do That, women, we knew that they didn't yet have these rights that the Constitution is talking about protecting. Down below it also says, you know, she told him when he came out, I could do that. And her husband said, politics is the business of men, my dear, he said. And she said, it's our country too. So she knows she's a citizen of the United States and that she should be able to have these rights that the Constitution now protects. So one piece of information that we can find in both texts is that the role of the Constitution informs us about the Constitution protects the freedoms and rights of citizens. And I Could Do That, we could tell that Esther Morris felt that women should be protected and have the same freedom and rights as everyone else. She believed that women should be included as actual citizens of the United States. Go ahead and write your information down on your paper if you haven't yet. If you have, go ahead and think about something else, another detail or piece of information that you can find in both texts. In our first text, on page 661, in paragraph 3, it says, Esther invited the two men running for the territorial legislature to her house to speak to the citizens. Then she sent out invitations to the most influential people in the territory. Come for tea and talk to the candidates. This reminds me of, in our second text, it says the Constitution sets up the United States government as a democracy, which means that the people elect leaders to govern them. The government gets its power from the people. Citizens elect leaders to represent them in government. So both texts are talking about electing leaders and how the citizens are the ones that make the choice. So we can add to our graphic organizer that both texts talk about how citizens elect leaders to represent them in government. What is another detail you can find or piece of information that you can find in both texts? Let's review our learning target. I can integrate information from two texts on the same topic. So today we compared texts on the same topic. Tomorrow we will reread those same texts so that we can write a response to the text, integrating information from both of them. I have enjoyed doing some literacy learning with you today. Thank you so much for joining me as we keep learning from home. I look forward to seeing you again for another lesson on KSPS.